Today, as Wesley said, I do want to talk with you about what it means and why it is necessary to heal from a religious past. We all have one, that religious past. It is fitting that we explore this topic on Martin Luther King's Sunday because through his words and his deeds, Dr. King called for healing, both collective and individual, but healing with a purpose, healing so that we could live boldly and courageously as members of the beloved community that is yet to be. Dr. King had a relationship with Unitarian Universalism. When he put out the call in 1965 for white clergy to join him for the march from Selma to Montgomery, more than 200 Unitarian Universalist ministers responded. And Dr. King delivered the eulogy for UU minister James Reeb, who was killed for his participation in the march. Dr. King also delivered the Ware Lecture at our 1966 General Assembly. In it, he urged us to stay awake through the revolution. Beacon Press, the publishing arm of the Unitarian Universalist Association, published a collection of Dr. King's sermons in collaboration with Coretta Scott King, who is quoted as having said, "We gave a lot of thought to becoming Unitarian at one time, but Martin and I realized we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian." In a 2002 article in the Unitarian Universalist World magazine, Rosemary Bray McNatt, one of our African American ministers, who currently serves as president of Star King School for the Ministry, explores King's relationship with Unitarian Universalism and liberal religion. She explores it a little more in depth. Their reluctance to cast their lot with us was due in part to our predominantly white culture and partly due to our liberal theology, which they didn't find sufficient to sustain African Americans through the struggles of their daily lives, nor found it sufficient to sustain the strength and courage needed for the nonviolent resistance movement they were building. King's critique of liberal theology, one that is shared by others and one that we need to continually undertake, is that liberal theology's optimism regarding human nature is not sufficient to address the reality of human evil. And for the Kings, an absent or abstract understanding of God was not sufficient for the daily pain and suffering of living with oppression. In the words of Rosemary Bray McNatt, for King to have answered the call to a liberal religious faith, a faith that clearly resonated with him since his earliest days of graduate studies, however, would have meant a fatal separation from the sources of his power, a faith in a suffering God who stood with suffering people despite their failures and mistakes, a covenantal love between God and oppressed African Americans, the people who grounded King's passion for justice, but did not restrict it solely to themselves. We have some healing work to do. Our Unitarian Universalist congregations today are comprised predominantly of people not raised in the tradition, arriving at our doors having left a previous church or spiritual community. And without a show of hands, I think you all know who you are. Oh, they're going to show hands anyway. So largely, we're people who came out of other faith traditions or no faith tradition at all, drawn here by our wide embrace of diverse spiritual paths, our open acceptance of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and our commitments to social and environmental justice. This broad scope of diversity does make our congregations vibrant, interesting, exciting places to be, and challenging places to be. We often struggle to find a common language that speaks to our deepest faith values. Words like sin, repentance, and redemption don't always fall easily from our lips. And I've often fantasized and wished that Unitarian clergy were granted word processing programs that did more than a word count, but did a God count. Because what I have found to be true is that any given sermon, the God count needs to be somewhere between 0 and 10 for it to be tolerable in our UU congregations. We Unitarian Universalists can sometimes be intolerant of traditional theological language. And I believe this is true because it touches wounds from a religious past. These wounds, I know I carry them with me, and I guess many of you do too. These wounds can be from something hurtful that happened within a particular church community. Maybe a conflict among members or with leaders that escalated to the point of causing rift and division, or from hurtful and harmful behavior on the part of leaders or members. The wounds can be from preaching and teaching that instilled fear and shame or hatred. And the wounds can be from being shunned and excluded for asking questions or expressing doubts, or being shunned and excluded because you couldn't conform to rigid rules and expectations, or because of who you are or who you love. It's like the contemplative, mystic, and somewhat renegade priest of the Catholic tradition, Richard Rohr, says, somewhere along the line, the church became a sin management system rather than a place for being in relationship with a divine and holy presence, whether we call that divine and holy presence the universe or love or God. Psychology tells us that there is a natural human tendency to avoid or reject things that hurt or cause discomfort. It's like running away from problems, as in our story this morning. Avoidance and rejection, though, may even be necessary for a time for the healing process to begin. But eventually, like with all problems, what has been avoided and rejected must eventually be faced and worked through. Deconstructing old belief systems, and then, from the rubble, reclaiming, reframing, and restoring that which is worth keeping. Our congregations, at their best, are places where we do this work, where we build a theology that works for us. And Our congregations are places where this can happen to the extent that we are willing to create and sustain environments that both comfort and nurture, that are not necessarily safe space, but brave space, where we can risk being vulnerable. It's not in many places we can do that in our world today. And it does take courage, because it's as author Annie Dillard writes, "It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense. Or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return." The church, or any spiritual community for that matter, is a human institution. It's a human institution that serves divine purposes. And as a human institution, it is as inherently imperfect as we are. It is as inherently imperfect as the human persons who create, uphold, and sustain the institution. It should be no surprise then that experiences within the church will be both positive and negative, because life is like that, right? Experiences here will be the same, because when we come here, we are invited to bring our whole selves. And because this is true, there will always be something to be healed. And because the church exists to serve a divine transcendent purpose, we are called to live as best we can from a place of wholeness and a place of integrity, called to do the work of healing. If we are caught in an inescapable web or network of mutuality, as Dr. King said, we need to heal both collectively and individually, because what any one of us does affects the whole. Over the years, Unitarian Universalists have been good at looking outward for what needs healing. We're good at looking outward for what needs healing in our larger society, but not always as good at looking inward for what needs healing in us, what needs healing individually, and what needs healing collectively as a faith community. Though I do think that we have made some great strides in recent years. I've often wondered what Martin Luther King would have to say to Unitarian Universalists today. Clearly, the revolution he urged us to stay awake is not over. All those years ago, he called us to stay awake, and the call is the same today. White supremacy culture and the enshrined racism it upholds is still with us. I wonder what he would have to say about the practice of liberal theology in our congregations today. When Bill Sinkford was elected in 2001 as the first African American to fill the role of president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, he called us to engage what he called a language of reverence, reclaiming and reframing a theological language sufficient to address the emotional and spiritual suffering that accompanies oppression, a theological language that enables us to be in conversation with other faith traditions that partner with us as we do the work of social justice. He was calling us to learn to talk about God, the God of our understanding. I wonder if Dr. King would see changes in us as a result of reclaiming language we had previously rejected. And I wonder what he would think about our current efforts at widening the circle of concern by centering the voices and experiences of the people most affected by the oppression of racism and all of the other interlinked oppressions of homophobia, sexism, isms of all kinds, xenophobia. I wonder if he would see it as us healing from wounds of our collective past as Unitarian Universalists. As I said, we're good at doing the work out there, not as good doing it in here. And I wonder if Dr. King today, I wonder if he would hear echoes of his words in our work today, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that working on our own healing is doing the work of justice, making ourselves stronger and more courageous for showing up in the world as a force for positive change. We all come here with wounds, myself included, and it is here that I come again and again for the healing balm of religious community, where together we go not around or over or under, but through our brokenness, where we hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope, not for ourselves alone, but for a world transformed for the beloved community that is yet to be. In closing today, I invoke the words of Mark Morrison Reed, a Black Unitarian Universalist minister and author of the books Black Pioneers in a White Denomination and Darkening the Doorway, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism. The words of Morrison Reed speak to the healing power of religious community, the community that we make together. He says, the central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. And as we take these words into our lives, may we carry the vision of Martin Luther King forward, the vision of a healed and transformed beloved community, for we are now keepers of the dream. May it be so, and may we make it so through our living.